look at a report by Corruption Watch entitled Land Corruption and Discrimination, their research findings on the land situation in South Africa. And the research looks at the intersection of land corruption and discrimination in the Republic. We speak now to Melusi Ncala, senior researcher at Corruption Watch. Melusi, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Let's start with how the research was conducted.
Hi, Dudu. So we've been involved in the Land and Corruption in Africa project since about 2014, 2015. And over the years, we've looked at various issues relating to land, mainly based on the whistleblower accounts that we have been receiving. This particular research is born out of the fact that we've been also receiving issues relating to farming communities, particularly farm worker equity schemes. And we then conducted research looking at what has been happening in terms of people's rights being violated, financial irregularities, improper accounting processes. And yeah, it's a really tragic story. That's what the findings are, because people's human rights have been abused, their labor rights have been abused, and there are serious irregularities in terms of the land policy.
All right. Let's take a look at that, in particular, irregularities in terms of the land policy, because on page 11 of your report, you note that almost 30 years after the fall of the apartheid regime, vast inequalities continue to permeate South African society, preventing individuals from exercising their land rights on an equal basis with others. While the state has developed a robust anti-discrimination framework, non-implementation remains a challenge, and some areas have proven particularly difficult for the law to penetrate. Which areas have proven particularly difficult for the law to penetrate?
So farm worker equity schemes were started in the 90s. And the rationale for government then was to pair commercial farmers with farm workers for the purposes of upscaling them so that they can have skills, business skills. That is, to be able to operate and have access to land. But the incentive for that government gave at the time was to tell commercial farmers that they will give them grants. For each employee that they have, they would get either 20, 30,000, 40,000. And unfortunately, commercial farmers have not lived up to their side of the deal, and government is well aware of it, even though they've been hiding it. So when we talk about areas that could not be where this is not happening, it's particularly in the Western Cape, where most of these equity schemes have been found missing.
And
wanting.
Sure. We'll get into the consequences in a few moments, because on page 6 you also note a combination of agrarian reform, land restitution and redistribution programs have led to significant tracts of land changing hands. However, land continues to be concentrated in the hands of the few, and these reforms have done little to address underlying structural inequalities. Recent estimates suggest that 0.28% of the country's farms produce around 80% of the value of agricultural production, with a majority of smallholder farmers in rural areas unable to meet their basic needs. What allows for this to still continue in 2023?
When we talk about land exchanging hands, it's within private hands. Predominantly, it's a white sector. The agriculture sector is predominantly white, and it's old money. Some of these are families that have benefited already from apartheid times and continue to benefit in present-day South Africa. And then land that is owned by the state, that land is usually subjected to other policy strategies. But these farms that the state end up giving to beneficiaries, they become white elephants. No one really understands the business model there. These farms don't become productive. So on the one hand, we have private interests who's forever benefiting from the system, And then on the other hand, where we do have beneficiaries, they're not fully supported by the state.
Is that what we call corruption?
What we call corruption in this particular regard in this report is in relation to equity schemes. So financial irregularities, when you have people who are supposed to be beneficiaries, who are shareholders in these equity schemes, they're not receiving their dividends, they're not receiving information related to the businesses that they party to, then yes, there are implications and signs that there's corrupt activity. When you have businesses that are getting 10 to 20 million rand from the state, and they cannot account to their beneficiaries, nor can they account to the state what happened to that money, yes, it's indicative of unethical conduct. So when you think about this particular thing, so government had this report where they reviewed equity schemes, and they've had this information from the public. There were about 137 equity schemes that government was aware of. Even that figure they're not sure of. But in that 137, they spent about 900 million rand. 683 million was allocated to 89 equity schemes. And government admits, or at least in this report, that beneficiaries have not really benefited from this.
Okay, so your research notes that perceptions of corruption are high. I do wonder why it is perceptions, because you also note on page 8 that corruption was most pronounced in rural areas where land is often held by communities and administered in accordance with local custom or tradition, while privately held land was less frequently cited in corruption complaints. Experts that you spoke to expressed concern regarding the situation of persons living in informal settlements, which are often located around urban areas. Given some of the irregularities that you have pointed out during the interview, what should we understand about corruption being most pronounced in rural areas versus privately held land?
So when you look at the issue of land corruption, predominantly how it's discussed in mainstream circles, it's in relation to peri-urban and urban settings. And there's a reason for that. It's because people are migrating to city areas, moving away from rural areas. So then the perception of corruption will be targeted at those areas. But that does not mean that in private hands there are no issues of corruption. It just simply means that we haven't received that many complaints as Corruption Watch. Though we need to understand that the intersection of corruption is between public sector and private sector. And when you understand it from that perspective, then you realize that actually there's more going on in private circles when it comes to improper conduct.
In your findings, your conclusion, you boldly note equality has been impeded by corruption. Given that you have been doing this kind of work as Corruption Watch since 2014, 2015, it's 2023. You take a look at the recent statistics or the recent census released by Statistics South Africa. It sort of makes sense in the broader context of this research as well, amongst other issues in the country. And so we have these reports, and then what happens? Are we going to be sitting here, if you and I are still alive, in 2035, 2040, and speaking about the same thing?
I mean, when it comes to this particular research study that we have published with the podcast series, what we're hoping to do is firstly bring awareness to the public. So such engagements are helpful for that, because people need to be informed and understand why the land question remains unresolved. What are the issues? When government says, yes, we're dealing with it, we've got policies and programs, what's actually impeding? And it's clear that corruption is a huge factor when it comes to that. What we're then hoping to do following that is to hold those who are in the wrong accountable. These are the officials at the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development, and also then the commercial interests that have benefited from this. So this is going to be part of our next advocacy plan to actually hold those people accountable, and hopefully then we can change this conversation. But ultimately, it's the politicians that we need to hold accountable, because they are the ones who make the rules. They are the ones who come up with these programs, and they are the ones who are often found to be helping their friends to get into these deals. So members of the public need to think about that when they go and elect people next year.
As you noted on page 11, almost 30 years after the fall of apartheid, vast inequalities continue to permeate South African society. What has been the consequences, more so when you speak of the inequalities when it comes to the issue of land in South Africa? What have been the consequences?
I mean, on the daily basis, or at least weekly, if I have to be somewhat, modest about the figures, to say that people are being evicted from farms, from informal settlements, and there's little to no accountability for that. People's homes are being demolished, and that's only some of the human rights violations. In this particular research, we learned about people not even being paid proper wages, people not receiving their dividends, or at least those dividend payouts being irregular. So these are some of the consequences. When you look at that, you see that it basically perpetuates poverty. It perpetuates inequality as well in the country, because these are the most vulnerable people. These are marginalized people, and something needs to get done about it.
Melusi Ncala, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. He's with the Corruption Watch on the report on land corruption and discrimination, their research findings on their website for more on that report.